Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. This is Declan Byrne with the WiMAX Forum. I'm joined by Jim Slanowski, who's the VP of Products for Siemens Ruggedcom, and Gene Crozier, who's with our certification lab, and Alessandra Rocha, who's the host and has organized this. Thanks, Alessandra. The purpose of this webinar, which probably will go 30 to 45 minutes, including time for Q&A, is really to talk about what's been happening with the CBRS Citizen Radio Service rule set within the FCC for the last couple of years. And we had found as a WiMAX forum that a number of utilities, wastewater, and others in the energy sector, we call the smart grid sector really, had been utilizing 3.65 GHz with WiMAX products successfully for a few years. Really since the last rule change allowing for that to happen. And the Federal Communications Commission under the prior administration undertook an action really to find a lot more spectrum. I think it was 1,000 megahertz of spectrum. And they were repackaging, renaming, reformulating the rule sets around lots of spectrum, but certainly also around 3.65 gigahertz. Really from 3.5 to 3.7, and as a consequence, there was quite a bit of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around what was the FCC going to do. There was a year and a half long process where we in the WiMAX Forum were joined by a number of utilities and manufacturers, sort of lobbying, making our voice heard within the Federal Communications Commission around what we thought should and shouldn't happen with that spectrum, and we were modestly successful, I think, and the slide deck will hopefully paint that picture and answer your questions, in securing kind of ongoing, sort of comfortable access for utilities and folks in the energy sector particularly, to this band of spectrum. And we thought it would be useful to sort of review the bidding on what has happened, what exactly is available, what you might need to look for from a vendor in terms of how, if you wanted to access this spectrum, and also have a couple of experts on the line to sort of answer your questions about where is this going, what are these environmental sensing capabilities, and what is the SAS and a lot of black box stuff that Federal Communications Commission has been talking about. Sort of debunk a lot of that, we hope. So I'll just, the format of the program, I think it's only about 15, 20 slides, is we have a couple slides talking about the WiMAX Forum. We'll move on to Siemens. Jim Slanowski is going to present really the meat of the presentation, and then I guess Gene will close. We've been around for the WiMAX Forum, which I run, is a small organization. We are industry-led. We're not-for-profit. We're based in the United States. I think everyone on the call knows who we are. What I like to say is we don't develop standards, but we sort of curate them. So our standards come from the IEEE, 82.16 particularly, and we form working groups that are sort of sector-specific, whether it be smart grid, which is the point of the call today. We're also active in an aviation working group for AeroMax, which is another set of technical profiles that is derived from the standard, IEEE standard. But we develop these technical profiles in concert with the manufacturing community and the user community to develop equipment profiles that manufacturers can build to, ensuring conformance to the standard, interoperability, and things like that. We also, critically, we continue to perform a certification activity where manufacturers that want to sell whether it be Y-Grid compliant equipment or AeroMax compliant equipment, go through the paces at our lab and get certified to conform to the technical profile of the standard. So that's sort of the heart of what we do as an organization. We serve a number of markets. We still continue to serve telecom, well, that's a fading market for us. But on the enterprise space, we're pretty active in aviation, to be sure, but there are, I don't know, 10, maybe 15 Y-Grid, WiMAX-based deployments across the United States, maybe more than that, some quite large by energy utilities, and some are just beginning, some are mature, and others are sort of incrementally growing on a success basis. The applications for smart energy would be well known to the utilities on the call. Distribution automation management is probably the largest or the most common application. Certainly security, surveillance, or redundancy are others, and remote site communications. Again, Jim from Siemens, Ruggedcom, can speak to any of these. So I want to move on to the discussion. I don't want to take a whole lot of time. So Jim, I'd like to pass it to you, if that's okay now, and just let me know how you want to, when you're ready to advance the slides.
Yeah, no problem at all, Declan. Can everybody hear me all right?
I can, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, you're clear, Jim.
Okay, good. Thanks, Eugene. So my name is Jim Sanowski. I'm the VP of Product Management for Ruggedcom products with Siemens. I'm based in Concord, Ontario, in Canada. And what I want to do is just spend some time chatting with you about, the CBRS, or the Citizens Band Radio discussion, and talk about, how to actually leverage the rules that are in place now to access spectrum for, for your needs. So, Declan, if you could move forward one slide, please. Oh, sorry, you got that one. Thank you. Yeah. So, as Declan mentioned, the CBRS topic has been, I guess, been moving forward in the FCC and in the industry for the last 4 years, I would think, if not longer. And they finally baked it about a year and a half ago. But there is some discussion now with the new administration and the new FCC head looking to optimize the rules based on some helpful suggestions from the big cellular providers, who we all know are altruistic in nature and wouldn't be suggesting anything that would be damaging to the industry. So they're really focused on the lower 100 megahertz of the band, where they can get priority access licenses. So all that current FCC activity that you might or might not have heard about is focused on the PALs, the priority access licenses. All the suggested rule changes don't impact the GAA rules, and really because PALs aren't allowed in 3.65 to 3.7, and there is no suggestion that and the FCC is not considering allowing PALs in 3.65 to 3.7 gigahertz. There is no impact on the GAA rules, or the general availability rules. So obviously, because the rule changes were proposed by the Salcos mostly, T-Mobile in particular, the proposals favor the way Salcos like to do business. They like long-term licenses. They like big geographical areas for the licenses to apply to. And they, I'm sure they don't enjoy paying a ton of money for licenses, but it does kind of tilt the competitive environment in their favor. So those are the kind of rule changes that they're suggesting. And if you read through through all the documentation available on this, there's lots of resistance to the suggested changes, but the FCC appears to be favoring some of them. However, the good news for this discussion is, again, none of these impact the GAA rules. So if you could move forward one slide, Declan.
Yep.
So, I mean, the documents that cover the CBRS band are quite extensive. And, they talk about a number of things, such as, secondary markets for spectrum licenses, go in depth on the fixed satellite services stuff. They talk about, the ESC and how the incumbent naval radars need to be protected. But I've kind of boiled them down into about 5 important CBRS rules that would impact a Part 90 user or someone who wants to use the band from 3.65 to 3.7 gigahertz. So just quickly, the 5 topics are, there's 3 tiers: incumbent, priority, and general. I'll get into what those are. The SAS and the ESC are required to enable the CBRS. What device types are in the CBRS, grandfather protection zones, and band map and implications. So, and just to be clear, all of these rules apply to any and all RF technologies deployed in the CBRS band. I mean, at Siemens, we offer a WiMAX-based product called the Ruggedcom Win for this band. There's other companies that offer other technologies. There's the big infrastructure suppliers, RF infrastructure suppliers are looking at providing LTE options in the band. But no matter which technology is chosen, the rules apply. So if you can move forward. So first of all, the 3 tiers. I'll just quickly go through this because I'm assuming you're familiar if you're on this call. So there's incumbent access, and this is basically the highest priority incumbent is the Navy radar, which is protected by the environmental sensing capabilities and the SAS. The environmental sensing capability are sensor devices that are deployed along the coastlines that basically detect when the Navy radars are in range, and it tells anything that could potentially interfere with the Navy radar to shut down or go to a different frequency. A fixed satellite service is geo-protected by the SAS, the spectrum allocation or spectrum access systems. So the fixed satellite service guys have to register with the SAS, and then the SAS calculates the protection contour around them. So there's no sensing capability for fixed satellite. It's simply based on geography and what the SAS calculates as the proper protection contour. The priority access tier is the PALs that I discussed earlier, or priority access license. And this is licensed use, again, enabled by the SAS, that has priority over the GAA, but the incumbents receive interference protection from the PAL users. And then there's general authorized access, or GAA, and that's licensed by rule via the SAS. And what licensed by rule means is if you meet the FCC requirements on equipment and RF radiation interference and all that stuff, all you have to do is tell the SAS that you're putting up a base station or putting in a device, and you're licensed. So it streamlines the licensing process quite a bit, but it does involve a third party that runs the SAS system that you have to negotiate registration with, both technically and commercially. So the SAS is used to facilitate coordination among GAA users, and the SAS has to provide protection to incumbent and PA users. So there's the 3 tiers. Are there any questions on that at the moment, or I think we're saving them to the end, I believe. Is that correct, Declan?
Yeah, there's an opportunity for folks to ask questions at the end.
Okay. So please, if anything comes to mind, write them down, and then we'll address them during the Q&A. If we go to the next slide, please. So the spectrum access system and the environmental sensing capability. Current view is they'll be available mid to late 2018. So the SAS is a third-party database that is certified by the FCC, and the CBRS devices cannot operate without registering with it once it's available. So in the meantime, before the SASs are available, there are temporary licenses that you can obtain to deploy equipment. And the exception to this is for grandfathered devices, and I'll get into that in a little bit, what grandfathered devices are. But they can operate prior to the April 17, 2020 of the expiration of the grandfathering period. So the SAS is required to enforce the 3-tier structure, so providing protection to the incumbents, then the PALs, then GAA resolving conflicts. So the SAS is a key piece of this. Most vendors that I'm aware of, including Siemens, have already done trials with at least one SAS vendor. And we have products that will allow, in Siemens' case, we call it a SAS gateway. And this allows our base stations to register with the SAS and continue to operate. Just to be clear, if you're a grandfathered system, you don't actually have to implement the SAS until April 17th, 2020. But there are some interesting implications as to why you'd want to do that as soon as it's available. And I'll get into that in a little bit. And then there's the ESC, the environmental sensing capability. As I said before, it's used to sense the presence of the naval radar. It notifies the SAS when the radar is present, and the SAS will act to protect the radar when necessary, either by shutting down radios or moving them to a different channel. Now, I guess if we move forward to the next slide. CBRS device types, this is basically just straight out of the report and order. End user device is kind of defined as maximum 23 dBm per 10 megahertz EIFE. A category A device is 30 dBm. It can be used indoor and outdoor, and operations everywhere outside of a DoD protection zone. In 3.550 to 3.650, and then in operations in 3.65 to 3.7, everywhere outside the fixed satellite services and DoD protection zones. And then category B is 47 dBm, and pretty much outdoor only, requires professional installation. It can be operated in 3.550 to 3.650. It can operate outside the DoD protection zones and requires the ESC and SAS approval in that band. And in the 3.65 to 3.7 portion of the band, it can operate everywhere outside the fixed satellite service and DoD protection zones. So just some idea of the device types and where they can operate. Next slide, please. So grandfather protection. So this applies to the 50 megahertz from 3.65 to 3.7 gigahertz only. And this really is aimed at the Part 90 uses that were in place prior to the CBRS band coming along. And the FCC recognized that there is a significant investment in Part 90 licenses and Part 90 equipment. And they wanted to make sure that the existing uses could continue. So they wrote that into their report and order. Then there's a 5-year transition to CBRS. It started basically April 17, 2016, and ends, or 2015, sorry, and ends April 17th, 2020. And how they define which devices are eligible for grandfather protection. They must have been registered in the Part 90 FCC database by April 17, 2015, and they must have been in use by April 16, 2016. Again, grandfathered equipment is exempt from the full band rule, and the full band rule basically means the equipment has to be able to operate from a 3.55 to 3.7. But grandfathered equipment can, if it's only able to operate from 3.65 to 3.7, can stay in service. Grandfathered equipment can become a CBS device using SAS gateway or proxy. And actually, it's exempt from the full band rule even after April 17, 2020. So upcoming is now a pretty key point that if I put you to sleep so far on the presentation, you probably should wake up right now. It's important to register the frequencies and service contours with the SAS once it's available. And why is that important? Well, that defines your grandfather protection zone around your equipment. And it also, assuming that you'll be registering as a GAA, it also kind of gives you squatters' rights on that portion of the band that you registered. So you've got equipment in service, your grandfather, the SAS comes along, you register with the FCC on the site that I'll show you a link to, at least for the training material. And then you register your grandfathered devices and get your protection zones in place. And then you register with the SAS once it's available. And that's a key point that, based on discussions we've had with the SAS vendors, and the one in particular that we've done interoperability with and have established that we can interwork with, they don't plan on moving GAA users around in the band. So once you're registered with the SAS and you're on a frequency, a 10 megahertz chunk of frequency, as long as you keep pinging the SAS and telling it that you're still in service and your equipment's all good, they won't give away your frequency to anybody else. So it's kind of like establishing squatters' rights. Fly in the ointment there is, in order to get registered with the SAS and for them to accept the registration, you have to have the equipment built out, deployed, and being radiating before they will, or at least ready to radiate, before they'll grant you the GAA authorization. So there's a time window from between now and when the SAS gets put in service that people can really establish a footprint if they can move quickly in terms of getting equipment online and ready to radiate, especially in the 3.65 to 3.7 band. There's a lot of Part 90 users that already have equipment, they're already using it, and it's critical that they jump onto the SAS and register their devices as soon as one of the SASs is available. And then the last point for grandfather protection is you're treated as an incumbent user during the transition period. So if we can go to the next slide. Hang on, don't click yet. this slide builds, Declan. So just to show you a graphical license map between 3.55 gigahertz to 3.7 gigahertz, and what is in that license or in that map. You see the first portion of the band here, colored in purple, is the incumbent access. So that's Navy radar, and they're typically between 3.55 and 3.65 from what I was able to determine. If you click again, Declan, you can see the fixed satellite service is the next incumbent that shows up. There's a lower portion where they're kind of deployed in 3.62 to 3.65. And then there's an upper portion where they go from 3.70 upwards to 4 something or other, which isn't really important for our purposes. You click again. Then we see the next area of interest is the PALs, the priority access licenses, which are available by auction. Even though this is covering about 100 megahertz, only in this range, only 70 megahertz of that can be usable for PALs in any particular license area. So the FCC is basically saying that there's going to be room for 3 GAAs no matter where in that 100 megahertz. If you click again. Animation's not working so good. So, and then we see where the GAAs are available by rule. So basically you can see the 3 different license tiers, if you will. There's the incumbent access, which is kind of automatically granted. They have protection. Then there's the PALs, which you have to purchase at auction. And then GAA is available by rule, which means, you know, if you have the equipment that's compliant and you're registered with the SAS, then you can basically establish a GAA footprint anywhere in the band. However, for a Part 90 user, if you click again, we see where the Part 90 grandfathering is possible, and that's between 3.65 and 3.7. You also see that there's really no Navy radar or PALs or fixed satellite service in the 365 to 37 part of the band. If you click again, come on, animation. I don't know if it showed up yet. It hasn't showed up on my screen yet. Declan?
Yeah, it's showing on mine.
Okay. Let me just, so
Sweet spot.
So basically, yeah, so that gap where Part 90 is possible, that's the sweet part for, basically the sweet spot for Part 90 uses. So anybody that's got a Part 90 license or, and is grandfathered, that's great. Anybody that wants to use 365 going forward, or the CBRS band, kind of in my view, the best real estate to go after with the least potential for disruption is where the Part 90 grandfather is possible, and now we see the happy face. So that's, in my view, where for sure Part 90, previous incumbent Part 90 users with grandfather protection should focus their efforts in terms of registering with the FCC and registering with the SAS gateways once available. But also anybody else that's interested in the CBRS band and doesn't want to pay for a PAL, probably the priority should be in that 365 to 37 band, or 37 area of the band. And again, the key thing there is it's a bit like a gold rush or a spectrum gold rush. You know, the telcos, in my view, are fighting over the bottom 100 megahertz, trying to get PALs because they want to secure their licenses. But my interpretation of the rules, and this is just my opinion, it's not a legal opinion, and I'm not suggesting you take action on it. But my opinion is if you establish a footprint in the sweet spot between 365 and 370, and you jump on it when the SAS comes online and you've got equipment ready to roll, then you're pretty much golden for as long as you can keep that equipment up and you keep talking to the SAS gateways, or the SAS systems. Nobody's going to move you off there, and your license cost is basically whatever can be negotiated with the SAS service provider in terms of registering it. So if we move on. So I just thought I'd give you a what would I do scenario. There's two scenarios. So if I was a Part 9 user with grandfather status and a continuing need for broadband 4G wide area wireless private infrastructure, what would I do? So first the thing I would do is register my devices with FCC to secure the grandfathered status. And you can see the link there in the presentation that takes you to some tutorials that tell you how to register your grandfathered wireless devices. What I'd also do is contact my equipment vendor or vendors to obtain their version of what we're calling a SAS gateway or a proxy. And that's basically just something that allows the current base station equipment and devices to communicate with the SAS. I'd make sure that my equipment vendor and the SAS vendors were working together for trials and pilots, and I'd want to participate in a trial and pilot just to get comfortable with the technology. And then I would use the SAS immediately, once available, to establish my GAA presence in the SAS for the grandfathered areas. I'd also build out new sites ASAP prior to the SAS being available to establish a GAA presence in the SAS once it is available. Again, you can't register a non-working site in the spectrum access system. It actually has to be working, it has to be ready, or it has to be ready to radiate. Then when you get the license from the SAS or the approval from the SAS, then you can start radiating. So it's critical that these are built out and ready to go when you request an allocation of spectrum from the SAS. And I would stick to the upper 50 megahertz as a general rule, and let the telcos fight over the PALs and deal with the incumbents, because that 50 megahertz, the old 365 to 37 band, is some of the most unencumbered, is the most unencumbered portion of the spectrum in terms of having to defer to PALs or incumbents. You basically don't have to. You're fine, right? As I showed from the map. So next one. Okay, I'm not a Part 90 user. I don't have grandfather status, but I do need broadband 4G wide area private wireless infrastructure. What would I do? Well, I'd contact an equipment vendor that supports the SAS gateway and proxy and full band CBRS devices. I'd work with those vendors to establish trials and pilots, and I'd try to build out new sites as soon as possible so I can establish a GA presence in SAS for those areas. So similar, other than the grandfathering thing, similar strategy to the previous slide. And then again, I try and stick to the upper 50 megahertz as a rule because I don't have to fight for it with Cellcos or PALs. Next one. Oh, there we go. So I mentioned working with vendors. So what would the vendor capabilities be that I would want? So I'd want them to have base stations that support the full CBRS band, obviously, because it's important to be able to access the full band as part of the FCC report and order. Devices need to do that unless they're grandfathered. I'd want end user devices that support the full CBRS band. I'd want a solution for efficient communication with the spectrum access systems. If I'm a utility, I want a device solution tailored for utility use cases. If I'm another type of Part 90 user, I might have my own particular scenarios like uplink, downlink mixing, that kind of thing. And I'd want to make sure that my vendor could support that. I'd want a vendor with strong RF services capabilities. I want them to be local, if possible. And I'd want someone who's got equipment in the field with a strong track record of deployments in the band. And if we go to the next one, and Siemens Ruggedcom status in terms of our WIN product line, we obviously check all those boxes because I made the slides. So I certainly wouldn't put something on there that we didn't meet. But I think that's the end now, unless Eugene had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, Jim, I was just as a way of opening the discussion, one of the things I was going to ask was, what happens after April 2020? You're protected, but if there's no issue with radar, then what's the thoughts? And you've established yourself, but what's the thought that is going to happen after then? Or is that unknown?
Well, after April 2020, the grandfather protection goes away, and then you basically become whatever your license status is with the SAS. So if you're a grandfathered user and you're operating in the 3.65 to 3.7 band, which by definition you are, that's the only portion of the band that has grandfathered users, because that was where Part 90 was. You just become a GAA on the spectrum that you're using. So the information we have from Federated Wireless, who is the GAA that the SAS implementation vendor that we're working with closely, they're closest, is they typically won't move the GAA. I mean, there's no reason for them to, at least in the 3.65 to 3.7 band. And because GAAs are all the same priority as far as that goes, if you're registered and you're radiating and you continue to be registered and you continue to radiate, then they shouldn't move you. There's no reason for them to move you. Somebody else will have to work around you as opposed to you having to change the frequencies of your base stations. That's why it's very important to establish that footprint in the SAS as soon as possible. To basically, it's kind of like, the old West days where they'd go, everyone jump on horses and go stake out their territory. That's kind of what this is, right? Except you have to build out a radio network and then stake it out once the SAS is on board.
Right, so that implies having base stations in place and having a number of CPEs out there, if it's not the total number, but having some out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly depending on the device type. Like if your CPEs are end user devices, they typically don't have to register with a SAS. So you can build out mostly base stations if you want.